Please welcome back Ideas Remaking the World facilitator, Priscilla Douglas.
Welcome back to Ideas Remaking the World. This morning, we heard from the forward-thinking, future-leading, innovative Carmen Bess, the Chief of Police of Seattle. She is our first finalist. And now I'm going to introduce you to our second finalist. She's using cutting-edge data, big data, to heighten the profiles of women, to make certain that our voices are heard in media. Please welcome to the stage, IWF Canada, Shari Graydon.
I joined the board of Informed Opinion's predecessor almost 30 years ago. At my second board meeting, I went to the bathroom at the wrong time. And when I came back, I was president. Because as you probably know, there are no glass ceilings in underfunded women's organizations. At the time, we were conducting an annual study measuring how many men versus women were quoted in daily newspapers across the country. Here's the story our data told. Women were only worth quoting 1 in 5 times. The journalists devoting so much more space to the case being made by, for, and about men. That was then, 1991, 92, and then, oh my God, in 93, a sudden uptick in the papers we'd picked. More references to women, only 3%, but what if heaven sent a trend? We looked again. Which women, whose glory, and wept at the story instead. 2 young women raped, now dead, their killer arrested on the day we'd invested, we were divested of hope. Women literally dying to get into the headlines. 16 years, you can understand why we abandoned the research in disgust. 16 years later, noticing not much had changed, I founded Informed Opinions. We train smart women to speak up in their homes, in their workplaces, and especially in the media. Because media have the power to affect everything else. They wield outsized influence. And so the persistent challenge remains that journalists invite women to comment less often, and we decline more often. We have solutions to both of those problems. In the past 10 years, we have trained and motivated thousands of Canadian women to share their informed opinions with the media through written commentary and media interviews. We've also built an online database to make it easier for journalists to find women who will say yes to interview requests instead of, yeah, I'm not the best person. Because best person is, first of all, not the bar, and there is no single best person. I've often said yes to media interviews, but a number of years ago, a TV crew doing streeters approached my husband and I and said, "The Pope has just died, would you comment?" I said, "No, I don't think so," and kept walking. But from behind me, my husband, who hadn't been to church in 40 years, he said, "Sure." He bowed his head and solemnly declared, "It's a very sad day for Catholics everywhere." And after I said, "Honey, that was a little obvious, and wouldn't it be great if the next Pope were to come in with a new policy on birth control that wouldn't trap millions of poor Catholic women around the world in an endless cycle of childbearing and child-rearing?" And he said, "Yeah, Shari, that would have been great. Too bad you turned down the interview." His comments made the national news. But I'm one of 50% of the population who gives birth to everybody. In fact, most of us spend decades of our lives trying to avoid becoming pregnant, or trying to become pregnant and then dealing with the consequences of having been pregnant, which last forever. And as felicitous as they may be, they change our bodies, our brains, and apparently our willingness to ask for directions. So, when a journalist or conference organizer approaches you to solicit your informed opinion, it's a gift, girl. Someone going to amplify your views, that's news, a privilege that most women in your village, country, world will never get. So you can't let it go. No, do not decline any chance to speak a line. Opine, step up, speak out. Don't twist, just shout. Our work has made a profound difference in women's media engagement in this country. Many of those we've supported have successfully positioned themselves as go-to sources in their fields. And as a result of their increased profile in the media, they're being appointed to prestigious panels, to boards of directors, to the Canadian Senate. It's really clear that the perspectives the news media amplify set agendas, shape policy, and impact spending. But what we've noticed from our research is that when women's voices are missing, these issues get less attention. Some of them are heartbreakingly predictable: child, sexual, female, girls. But many of them are not, like food and water, evidence and impact, police and racism, treatment and safety. What issues close to your heart are on this list, and how much more of a priority would they become if women's voices were louder? I'm guessing you already know the business case for diversity, that including women's voices improves decision-making, makes companies more profitable and employees happier. Help us send the memo to media, because by and large their numbers aren't moving, and they have the power to affect everything else. That's why we built the Gender Gap Tracker. It is a revolutionary big data analytics tool using artificial intelligence to measure in real time the ratio of female to male sources quoted and featured in the news media. We're using it to monitor Canada's most influential news outlets, and it can be adapted to measure the same metric everywhere. When we began tracking the data last October, before we launched it, women's voices were only at 27%. That's a mere 5-point difference over where we were back in 1993 when we abandoned the manual content analysis research. That's indefensible. And we know it's indefensible because journalists who actively track the gender ratio of their sources reach parity. That's right, parity. Public broadcasters in Canada, in the UK, in Europe, who are actively paying attention to this, consistently feature 50% female guests on their talk shows. Bloomberg Business News mandates its reporters to quote at least one woman in every story. And reporters at The Atlantic have been doing this for years. Ed Yong, he covers science. He keeps a tracking sheet off the side of his desk to make sure that he's quoting 50-50, and he has done so. And he calls that spreadsheet a vaccine against self-delusion. That's what we need. And our accountability tool is now working to ensure that what can be done, that is being done, that it gets done, not just by the Atlantic and public broadcasters, but by everybody. Since we launched the tool, we have been invited into newsrooms to talk about why parity is important and how we can help. The requests to the women in our database have gone up by 250% since we launched the Gender Gap Tracker. It is already making progress, incremental, but it's making progress. Let me remind you of one concrete reason this matters. It wasn't fate back in 2008 when mortgage lenders' greed led with unprecedented speed to global financial collapse and alarming relapse of the Great Depression, feeding even more suppression of women's rights. In France, the Minister of Finance was asked what could have been done to avoid the ton of damage from which only the wealthiest escaped. And she said, "I must confess, if only Lehman Brothers had had a few sisters, we wouldn't be in this mess." Research backs her up. Scientific studies here and there show hire more women, higher up, plenty are able. And worldwide financial markets will be more stable because where many men take risk for short-term gain, more women consider consequences and long-term pain. Life trains us for that. Increasing the number of women being quoted and heard in the media will have incalculable ripple effects. And you don't have to be the head of the IMF. Malala Yousafzai and Greta Thunberg teach us that. There is power in our voices. If you can hear mine right now, please say, "Oh yeah." More visible and audible female role models make it easier for all of us to be taken seriously. Oh yeah. If women's voices were adequately reflected, medical research would deliver better health care, peace treaties would last longer, climate change would be a higher priority, and if women's voices had not been silenced, we would not have needed a Me Too movement. We could have saved millions of our sisters the trauma that made it necessary. Oh yeah. 15 years ago, I was invited to go on television to debate the dubious merits of a beer commercial. The commercial featured scantily clad women in a bar, voyeuristic camera angles, and I said what any of you could have. Why are we still sexually objectifying women in the media in order to sell alcohol when we know that the incidence of sexual assault goes up when it's involved? I returned home to an email from Jennifer, an artist who had seen us debate this on television. She told me that at 17 she had been gang raped at a party and she had spent 10 years trying to paint her way out of her pain in therapy, and that every time she saw a commercial like the one we debated or an image in fashion media that conflates sex with violence and implies women are desirous of being violated, she relived the gang rape. And so she was never going on television or speaking publicly in the way that I had, but she so appreciated hearing her reality reflected in another woman's words. This is the power of our voices. With her permission, I removed her identifying information and sent her email to the ad executive who defended the ad on television. And he responded right away and he said, "Oh my God, I have a 2-year-old daughter and I never made the connection between women's real lived experiences and the images we disseminate. I will never create or defend them again." This is not his daughter. This is my granddaughter, Charlotte, in her sticker phase. I desperately want Charlotte to grow up in a world that respects her intelligence instead of prizing her purity and appearance. I desperately want Charlotte and all the Charlottes and Marias and Fatimas in your lives to be paid what they're worth, to be promoted when they're qualified, to be protected from sexual harassment or assault, whether they work in mining or the military. And I desperately want all of our grandchildren to inherit an inhabitable planet. I don't believe that's going to happen unless women's insights and interests are integrated into every important conversation we have in every country in the world. So please, if you can speak up in any arena, please do. Join or create a women's database near you. And if you are connected to a high-tech company or a research institution or a university, talk to them about adapting the gender gap tracker to measure these metrics in your media. This is a free, open source tool that we are invested in sharing elsewhere to create women's equality in a systemic way through the media, which influences everything else. In doing so, you will help us spread the message to journalists of every kind. Pay mind and make it your mandate to reflect the realities, the nuances and totalities of all the citizens you serve, women, men, black, white, gay, straight, indigenous, disabled, and everybody in between, because broadcasters who do this tell us they've seen their audience figures rise.
Oh, yeah, oh, yeah. If you have a voice, yes, what gets measured gets done.
Exactly.
Exactly. And using this big data, using this technology is amplifying, pointing a finger to where we need to hear women's voices. I'm wondering, and you started to touch on this, in terms of media outlets, you know, they want to make money. Does having women's voices, does that make a difference? Are they seeing a bottom line impact?
They're not sharing their success strategies with me, I'll tell you. But we know from anecdotal evidence that the Financial Times, for example, in reworking one of their newsletters, electronic newsletters, to appeal to women, they increased the male readership as well. We're 50% of the population. We exercise 60 to 80% of the purchasing power. Advertisers want to reach us, and we're consumers of media and everything else. So it's a business survival strategy to appeal to women.
And, you know, one of the things that you said, and I think this crosses over into a lot of industries, is that when women get asked, we don't always say yes.
Pick me.
And what are you doing specifically in terms of informed opinions to get women to speak up? I mean, you've told us all to say, oh, yeah. But are there any particular techniques?
So one of the things that I remind them is that, and women have a lot of reasons to say no, we're busy. We're raising children, taking care of elders. We know we're going to be held to a higher standard of authority. We're going to be criticized for our appearance. So lots of good reasons. But what I remind women is, if you say no, I'm not the best person, which is probably objectively true, they're not going to go to that mythical best person. They're going to go to the guy in the next office. You know that guy. And he may be smart, but he's no smarter than you. So that's what we tell women all the time. And, you know, I show the word cloud. I have lots of stories of women making a profound difference that wouldn't be present if their experience-informed opinions weren't there.
Yeah, exactly. Now, some people say, though, you know, you're talking about amplifying women's voices, and some people think that, well, maybe we should just focus on editorial, or maybe just focusing on a symptom, not the real problem.
There are lots of women in this country and other countries at senior levels in media, and I've met with many of them across the country, and it's clear it helps a little bit, But as you said, what gets measured gets done. And so all the women in the newsroom doesn't make a difference if they're defaulting to the same habits and Rolodex that their male predecessors have. We need to change the definition of what's news, and women's voices and experiences are part of changing that definition.
You know, sometimes it looks like women pile on other women sometimes and don't speak up. You know, this whole Meghan Markle thing that's happening is being led you. What can we do about that?
Well, appreciating that speaking up makes you a target. You're more likely to be criticized, especially if you're not white, affluent, slim, and straight. When a woman in the media, a politician, we've had prominent examples in Canada recently, is targeted, the rest of us, we need to have her back.
Yeah.
And IWF, we can do that deliberately.
Yeah. And lastly, Shari, you know, in your data, I'm wondering if you can have more granularity, more data about ethnicity and gender, you know, just a little more specificity. Is that possible? And I also want to know how IWF might be able to help you in getting this.
So we're gathering this data. There's so much else we could do with it. So we're actively seeking partners, research partners, funders who are interested in mining the data to measure additional metrics. We're scraping data, and you know, somebody's racial identity or sexual identity is not always mentioned in the news stories because we're measuring text. We can't do that yet, but there are brilliant minds who can probably figure out how to help us.
Well, thank you, Shari. Thank you for being a troublemaker, amplifying our voices, and bringing more influence to this whole area.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.